the next few classes is a way to think about it. So the first 3 classes were a crash course in the philosophy of psychology and the importance of critical thinking and expanding our understanding of causality. The next 3 classes are looking at some of the mainstream theories, behaviorism, information processing, and computational theorizing, evolutionary psychology. And it's, trying to pull out grains of truth, but for the most part, a lot of it is sort of a negative argument against some of these modes of theorizing, or at least really drawing attention to the fact that they have very limited use. After that, we'll be taking more of a positive approach in emphasizing, we're going to be building, I guess, like the trajectory of the course should tell a story almost, like, or at least the story as far as I'm able to make sense of it at the present time, and the theories that seem to make sense to me and arguments that seem to make sense. But that's not to say that it shouldn't be challenged all the way along if you feel inclined to, right? So. Does that make sense? If it seems like the terms, the behaviorist terminology that we're tossing around, that it's cumbersome for me, it's because it is. I have to really think about like how a behaviorist would see something or interpret something, and it's sort of hard work. So this is one lecture, one class where that's especially difficult. And the reason, in a way, is because the behaviorists, they eliminate, and explicitly it's stated, right? It's not a secret or something like that. They eliminate consciousness or first-person, experiences or thoughts or intentions or goals or anything. They don't care about any of that. And to anyone who's trying to have a full account of what a person is, like, well, I think we should probably care about that. That's pretty important. The behaviorist asks, why don't we make what we can observe the real field of psychology? Let us limit ourselves to things that can be observed and formulate laws concerning only those things. What can we observe? We can observe behavior, what the organism does or says. Now this is a little bit interesting. What do you notice in that last line that might be a bit of a head scratcher? Well, we might wonder, like, what is speech? What does it mean to say something? And can I observe speech? And is that a behavior? I mean, in a sense, obviously it is. There's, vocal cords and, kind of some guttural something or other that comes out. But it's not obvious that or in what way is that a behavior, we might be curious about. So the behavior scientist is construed as someone who searches for identifiable causes, while a cause is defined as a functional relationship between input and output variables. So stimulus-response relationships, at least as it relates to classical conditioning. And this is, sort of anticipating the information processing theorists that might look at this in terms of input, output, and so on. Now, this is what you want to do as we're working through these different theories. You want to think, okay, well, what is the causal emphasis here, right? So if we go back to our 4 causes, material efficient cause, formal final cause, when we're talking about someone searching for identifiable causes construed as a functional relationship between input and output, what does that sound like? What causal frame are we using to interpret this? So we're looking at what we can observe. What we can observe is behavior. Also, what we can observe is we can observe artifacts in the environment, objects, processes, right? And all we're interested in is, again, what we can observe over there and the interaction between them. Stimulus response, right? So an unfolding of events over time, involving an object that is being impinged upon or contact with some stimulus that then leads to a response. What does that sound like? Material efficient causality. Primarily emphasizing what? So we're talking about functional relationships between things. Efficient cause, with material cause in the background, is, insofar as we're considering these things objects or things or something like that, right? It is true that we could trace human behavior not only to the physical conditions which shape and maintain it, but also to the causes of those conditions and the causes of those causes almost ad infinitum. But there's no point in going back beyond the point at which effective action can be taken. That point is not to be found in the psyche, and the explanatory force of mental life has steadily declined as the promise of the environment has come to be more clearly understood. So this is the way that a behaviorist, and this is what the author, I think is William Baum, kind of gets into this, the determinist sort of thesis or assumption that everything is just cause and effect unfolding, cause in the material at the efficient sense, and that obviously there's no room for formal cause framings or teleological behavior that might be intentional or driven by some meaningful sense in which the person frames their experience and so on. So there's no such thing as free will. It's just all deterministic unfolding of events over time, according to this view. Now, there's something kind of really funny in this paragraph, and I'm just going to highlight and see if you guys can make sense of what it is. She says, but there's no point in going back beyond the point at which effective action can be taken. Now, what's kind of funny in that, given what he's trying to assert?
They're drawing like an arbitrary line in where cause matters versus where it doesn't matter from before. Like, who's to say where effective action is relative to which causal point of the chain of events?
It seems like there's an insertion of a perspective of some sort, doesn't it? Like, that's what you're saying, I think, that, like, well, who determines, like, when,
Yeah, to even say it is like a formal final cause.
So, I mean, there's lots of ways, actually, to kind of problematize this. So when we say that there's an action, what are we doing? We're saying there's a discrete, kind of conceptual, spatial, temporal time block that we're analyzing, and a behavior or whatever that we're framing as a discrete act. What allows us to frame it as such? What allows us to do that? Well, I mean, what we're doing is we're involving like a conceptual frame that we're putting on that. We're involving formal cause, and presumably for some purpose, right? That we're trying to make sense of something. But what allows us to frame it as an act? So if you think about it, like, everything is, on one level, it's all just biological matter, just processes, unfolding of, particles impinging upon one another, and, forces, kind of that are part of that whole picture. But then, arguably, at some point, there's sentience, there's perception that emerges, and then there's awareness, but then there has to be, a separation between the site of awareness and the object that you're aware of, and that allows you to see yourself as a subject, and there's an object over there, and that allows us to then, through our intersubjective engagements, we can create abstractions and concepts, and that's what's happening here, right? Like, it would be hard to, like, how this could even be intelligible, I guess, without formal final causes, would be a head scratcher, I think. Okay, moving on. So, an unconditioned stimulus in the environment, such as being bitten, naturally causes an involuntary or an automatic unconditioned response. So it kind of has some kind of biological potency. It grabs hold of some kind of efficient cause, mechanism or something like that, and produces a predictable response. Then the unconditioned stimulus is paired with a typically neutral conditioned stimulus to create a learned association or conditioned response, such as the fear of water. And then the conditioned stimulus can elicit that conditioned response all on its own. And this is how phobias can develop. So a person who, let's say they're 2 or 3 years old, and they have a birthday party, and someone kind of pops a balloon right behind them. They weren't aware of it. It terrified them. maybe the people in the vicinity had like a poor response to that, and then they developed this terrible panic and anxiety as it relates to balloons, and that may generalize to other sorts of things that are similar to that, but and then there's this, this avoidance type thing, and avoiding the anxiety associated with that, so it reinforces or it fails to extinguish this phobia response. In operant conditioning, it's voluntary behavior that operates on the environment to somehow change it. The effect introduces a meaningful stimulus or consequence that alters subsequent behavior through a learned association, and this can be conscious or unconscious. So instead of just mere stimulus response, now we have technically response, stimulus, response. So it's almost like there's a kind of novel thing happening with this voluntary behavior, but it's not clear to me that Skinner notices anything, ontologically interesting about that. I think, as he was working with rats and pigeons or whatever, it was just, there wasn't an attempt to understand, well, why did the rat initially, or why did the pigeon initially do this or that? It's just wandering around its environment and just randomly does this, and then the reinforcement contingencies kind of take up from there. The idea is that the things that we do depend on reinforcements or punishments encountered in our environments. So what is a reinforcement? It's when a response is strengthened through association with a pleasant or rewarding stimulus, or by removal of an aversive stimulus from the environment of the organism. So in the case of positive reinforcement, it could be, just with your children, giving them approval and hugs or treats or rewards of some kind for appropriate behavior. Punishment is a response that is when a response is weakened through association with a punishing stimulus or by removal of a pleasant stimulus. So if you're speeding in your car and you get pulled over and you get a hefty fine, that's a punishment of sorts. Or it could be the removal of something pleasant, like I'm going to take your iPad away if you do this again, or in a certain sense, timeout kind of works in that way. You're having all this fun or whatever, but you pulled your sister's hair, so I'm going to take you away from this pleasant environment. Now you're going to have to sit over here. So reinforcement, punishment. So these are conditioned or learned responses that generally need reinforcement for the behavior to be established and maintained. Okay, so that should kind of get us all on the same page. We roughly know what behaviorism entails, I think. Okay. Now, you guys have all seen this video, I'm sure. They're probably playing it in every single class on behaviorism or whatever. This is the Big Bang Theory clip I think everyone has seen. So we're going to show this clip. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion afterward about kind of what's going on here, and I guess problematize some of how we might be inclined to interpret this. So hopefully this is going to play.
Are you finished?
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
What was that?
You said be nice to Penny. I believe offering chocolate to someone falls within the definition of nice.
It does, but in my experience, you don't.
Oh, sorry, Sheldon. I almost sat in your spot.
Did you? I didn't notice. Have a chocolate.
Thank you. What's this cartoon called again?
And it's not a cartoon. It's anime.
Anime. I knew a girl in high school named Anime. Anna Mae Fletcher.
You're here a lot now.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Zip.
Thank you. Chocolate?
Yes, please. Kim. Yeah, you know what? Hold on. Let me take this in the hall. You'll never guess who they got to replace you with work.
Okay. I know what you're doing.
Really?
Yes. You're using chocolates as positive reinforcement for what you consider correct behavior.
Very good. Chocolate?
No, I don't want it. Sheldon, you can't train my girlfriend like a lab rat.
Are you saying that I am forbidden from applying a harmless, scientifically valid protocol that will make our lives better?
Yes. You're forbidden.
Bad, Leonard.
What are, like, I wonder, could Sheldon, in fact, if he was to continue with this reinforcing, appropriate behavior from his perspective, could he get her to the point, do you think, where she is jumping out of a pool, balancing a beach ball on her nose? Like, could he pull that off, do you think, through the reward of chocolates?
Tending to do, not introducing new ones.
Okay. But, we can shape behavior, as it approximates. Like, I know someone who trained his dog to go in through the doggy door and get a beer out of the fridge, right? That's a very unlikely behavior, right? But through, progressive approximations, he was able to pull this thing off. Could we do the same thing with Penny? But what are some, where are some places where this would maybe kind of, you'd run into problems? Like, if he was to try to reinforce her to gradually become more and more verbally abusive or something to Leonard, like, would he be able to pull that off? Some people are saying yes. Really? You think people are that malleable and able to be manipulated that you could do that? Really? Okay, and anyone who disagrees with the people who are nodding, speak up. I want to hear from you. That's a good point. So someone who is weak-willed, weak-minded, minimal capacity for self-reflection, this kind of thing, they might be more inclined to get duped into some silly thing or inappropriate thing, yeah? But would we say that there would be, a point at which, like, it runs up against, like, I guess, would we say, if we want to, break away from the behaviorist line of thinking and we say that, okay, well, there's an individual there who, has the possibility of being aware of something, especially as it deviates from, their normal way of being in the world, or like who they believe themselves to be, right? I mean, would we say that at a certain point, like, there's an internal conflict at the very least? That there's a kind of oppositionality going on within the individual?
Rage into their minds and what they think is right and wrong is?
I think it has to do with all kinds of things. It has to do with, I think, it's going to run up against your values, your beliefs, your understanding of right and wrong. It's going to run up against, various feelings that you might have. Sure. I think, though, see, I think what I would want to say is that at a low level, like where the risks and the costs are pretty minimal, and I guess I like what you said there, kind of like that Sheldon's kind of will or desire or his goals, let's say, like they more or less line up with Penny's, right? Like, she's not doing anything that is outside of what she would happily do, or like, there's not a whole lot of, like, there's no dilemma there for her, I guess, right? And I think I would say that at a certain point, what happens is that when you nudge a person where there is a bit of a conflict, it suddenly lights, when people say, like, well, there's gradations or something. Well, I think at a certain point, the person does become aware, or there's an intuitive feeling. Like, if you're a person who is grounded in the world in an emotional way and with people and so on, like, you have a visceral reaction, right? Like when you are a moral being, it's not just this conceptual kind of heady thing, oh, I know the right thing to do because thou shalt not, blah, blah, blah. It's like you have a visceral reaction, like your body tells you that this is the wrong thing to do before your mind has to do any work. So it's almost like there's a conflict, I think, that would eventually come in. But I want to say that, it's also like the interpretation or the framing as well. Like when we say that, okay, well, why did this work? Well, I mean, chocolate is sweet, it's tasty, it gives a pleasurable experience, and you can kind of point back to, the dopamine systems and things like that, right? Well, yes. Now what happens though, so we can say that works because she has a nervous system that responds to sweets, right? What happens though, like would this play out in the similar way if Penny happened to be on a diet? And Sheldon, she knew that Sheldon knew that she was on a diet. I'm off sweets, no sugar, no carbs for a month. And she knows he knows that. Now what happens when he offers the chocolate? How is Penny likely to react to that?
Probably mad.
She'd probably be mad, right? You know that I'm on a diet, that I'm trying to stay on this, sugar-free, carbs-free sort of thing. What are you doing here? Are you trying to sabotage me, right? So the interpretation or the framing, I think, is very important. So again, according to Skinner, a self or personality is at best a repertoire of behavior imparted by an organized set of contingencies. For Skinner, personality is shaped by natural selection, cultural practices, and a person's history of reinforcement. But it's all a matter of natural selection, since operant conditioning is an evolved process of which cultural practices are special applications. So again, he's well within the realm of material efficient causation. There's gene-environment interactions, and culture for him is this sort of emergent phenomena that results from those interactions. What behaviorism rejects is the unconscious as an agent, and of course it rejects the conscious mind as an agent. A person is not an originating agent. He is a locus, a point at which many genetic and environmental conditions come together in joint effect. As such, he remains unquestionably unique. By the way, anyone who, just the masculine pronouns that are used in some of these older texts, like I hope, people aren't kind of reacting poorly to that. Like this is just, the way that people had written there at that time. So the uniqueness of the human being for Skinner is not that they have some capacity to, toward volitional action and choice and purposes and goals and things like that. That's not what makes a human being unique for Skinner. What makes a person unique is just that they're complex. They're complex, a complex assemblage of material efficient causes, a complex assemblage of events and matter, right? That's what it is for Skinner. Well, he would use voluntary, I think, in maybe a different way than we would. I think he would say that the environment engages with you in a way that you find yourself emitting behavior, something like that, right? But we'll kind of get into that in a little bit. But there's no mistaking that he was a determinist. So in dealing exclusively with material efficient causes, the behaviorist denies formal final causes, precluding any role for the person as self-determining agent. There's a fascinating account by Carl Rogers, who was a person-centered therapist or more of a humanistic theorist. He was a contemporary of Skinner, and they had plenty of engagements and interactions. And so Rogers here is commenting on an exchange that he had with Skinner, which is quite revealing in some ways. He says the following: "A paper given by Dr. Skinner led me to direct these remarks to him. From what I understand Dr. Skinner to say, it is his understanding that though he might have thought he chose to come to this meeting, might have thought he had a purpose in giving this speech, such thoughts are really illusory. He actually made certain marks on paper and emitted certain sounds, here simply because his genetic makeup and his past environment had operantly conditioned his behavior in such a way that it was rewarding to make these sounds, and that he, as a person, doesn't enter into this. In fact, if I get his thinking correctly, from his strictly scientific point of view, he, as a person, doesn't exist. In his reply, Dr. Skinner said that he would not go into this question of whether he had any choice in the matter, presumably because the whole issue was illusory, but stated, "I do accept your characterization of my own presence here." Right? So again, he's really doubling down. There's, for him, the person is just an unfolding of events, and that the environment, again, it engages with genetic presuppositions or genetic constitution in a way to cause one to emit certain sounds or behaviors or something like this. Again, I think we can problematize so much of what he's doing. I hope that you can kind of get a little bit of insight into what is, very odd about taking that sort of position. Mainly that we're just even, again, using language and speech. This is conceptual content that we are trading in. And that content arguably was part of a predicational process that someone or people had jointly engaged in, to produce this sort of thing. And again, there's an ontological difference between matter and concepts or ideas, beliefs, And we use those concepts and ideas and beliefs, and we kind of, flip the meanings around, and we kind of, predicate it in a particular way to line up with our purposes, our goals, and that's final cause. So final cause always uses the material in a metaphorical way, the material of formal cause in, laying out kind of plans and goals and schemes and things of that nature as it relates to us. So another way of putting some of this is that free will is only conceivable by appealing to the first person, the subject. Behaviorism involves extrospective, that is third-person theorizing, where determinism becomes the only sensible conclusion, which is, far from obvious if we were to start with a broader notion of causation, which is what we tried to do here. So I think if people read that paper and said, "My God, this is so convincing, I'm right on board, finally something makes sense to me," I think maybe, or I would invite you to consider, maybe what happened is that you just kind of lost sight of this piece that we're trying to build here. But if you wanted to make a case that we don't need formal final cause, then by all means, let's have that conversation. I don't know, again, I find it very difficult to kind of work within like a behaviorist kind of framework, or even try to build from that framework, kind of add things so it makes sense. But, I guess I laid out some different distinctions or things that we might just want to think about or consider. So we might think about differentiating different kinds of reinforcement contingencies. We might think about pre-specified reinforcement contingencies, that there are evolutionary pre-specified mechanisms that arguably respond, metaphorically speaking, to specific environmental inputs. And we can think about things like autonomic nervous system responses, nociceptive circuits involved in pain detection, mesolimbic dopamine systems, endogenous opiates, that give us a sense of euphoria and diluting our pain response, homeostatic regulating mechanisms involved in thirst and hunger and that sort of thing, various affect programs as they play into what it is for us to experience an emotion. And all of these things are part of our biological constitution. And so many of the things that we find rewarding or extremely uncomfortable, they are as such because they tie into our biology in that way. So it may not rule out voluntary action, but it does have important material efficient causal force. So again, we're within the realm of material efficient causation when we're appreciating those important parts of what it is to be a person. Then we might consider conditioned, learned-associative reinforcement contingencies. And so it implicates a pre-specified biology and material efficient causes, but operates indirectly through learned associations. So we can think about, to a certain degree, we can think about money as a secondary or generalizable reinforcer that we can use to purchase things that may have direct or biologically meaningful reinforcement, food, water, shelter, clothing, under the right conditions, of course. But then, there's another level, arguably, and we might consider that a learned symbolic reinforcement contingency. So some reinforcers have causal force not because they apply directly to a pre-specified biology or learned association with something that does, but through its symbolic value, where formal final causes are increasingly at work. So these might include cultural sources of symbolic significance, giving us a sense of value, purpose, and meaning. So for example, being a talented hockey player is a way of attaining symbolic worth in the Western world, but not so in non-Western indigenous communities. I guess one, and this is all kind of maybe a crude way of putting some of this stuff, but just to maybe open up some pathways to thinking about this stuff, we can consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That might help us out as a useful heuristic. So behaviorism may work well enough at the level of material efficient causes, but at the level of the symbolic, formal final causes come into play, necessitating an appreciation of the shared and singular first-person perspective and the role of the person qua agent. So at the low levels of that hierarchy, we arguably have, kind of more, biologically instantiated kind of mechanisms tying into environmental contingencies and things of that nature. But as we sort of move up that hierarchy, we get into these kind of more abstract, kind of symbolic, sources of meaning or value. And that's, when we talk about like self-esteem, like how you feel about yourself, how you think about yourself, in what way you make sense of yourself. Like, this is not something that you're able to understand, I don't think, at just a pure kind of biological, mechanistic level. So some of the contexts where behavior theory is incredibly valuable might include treatment of specific phobias, so exposure and response prevention. There was a client that I worked with at one point who had a needle phobia, and it seems as though the needle phobia kind of started, in a very specific moment where I guess they were like 2 or 3 years old and they had to get a flu shot or something like that. And for whatever reason, they were in the doctor's office and the parent wasn't there, and the doctor gave them the flu shot and they kind of freaked out and the doctor kind of held them down or something. And it was a very distressing experience for this person. And subsequently they had a panic type response. And any time they would need to get a needle. And it sort of generalized and kind of expanded to the point where they couldn't even, watch, a television show or a film that would have, the depiction of a needle or something like this. So in working with this person, we started, and this is what you do when you're trying to extinguish a phobia. There's a graded exposure. So first you might do it conceptually. Well, let's use the word needle, and on a scale of 0 to 10, like what's your level of anxiety if we just use the word needle in our conversation? Someone says, well, it's a 3 or a 4 or something like that, and you kind of do some breathing techniques and mindfulness exercises perhaps or something to help them kind of regulate their physiological arousal as you're approximating that stimulus, and then you get comfortable doing that, and then you invite them to maybe engage in imagery, like could you imagine what it would be like if you were in the doctor's office, blah, 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 this sort of thing. And then gradually, we had this person went to the pharmacist and got a needle, and they were okay at first. So they brought the needle into the office, and they were okay to a certain degree having the needle in their hand, but the moment it left their hand, then they suddenly got this spike of anxiety. So we would kind of work at that level, and we do these sort of anxiety regulating type things. And then we gradually move that, okay, the needle's now going to be not in your hands, but it's going to be on the table over there. And then gradually kind of worked up to, would you be okay with me holding the needle? And we'd do this sort of thing. So it's very difficult work, and it takes a long time, but you're able to kind of extinguish that sort of response by, again, like there's not this avoidance of the anxiety or escaping the anxiety. You're tolerating the anxiety, you're leaning into the anxiety, and the terrible thing that you anticipate is going to happen doesn't happen, and it extinguishes that response over time. We can also, we do this all the time, I think. We leverage our stimulus control to successfully meet certain ends or purposes. So ensuring that we don't go to the grocery store when we're hungry, right? Because when we do that, we tend to, whatever is appealing in that moment, right? If we know that we're the kind of person to sleep in or something like that, and our alarm clock is we hit the snooze button or something like that, then we set up another alarm clock, to try to force ourselves to. So there's unpleasant. Now we got this unpleasant kind of sound that's coming from now across the room. I got to get up and deal with it. So all these things are incredibly helpful and useful. And understanding and treating addictive behavior and forms of avoidance is also useful. So if having a fridge that's stocked with beer is, it's a rewarding stimulus that, that a person who is struggling with alcohol abuse or they're an alcoholic, not a good idea. So what do? They control that stimulus, they get it out of the house and deal with it that way. And some of the other ways in which, like, the behaviorist principles are useful, like they're useful as token economies in psychiatric wards, like people who are, in a really bad way, dealing with psychosis. You can get them to engage in, kind of self-care behaviors through a token economy. They kind of earn tokens for kind of gradual movement towards self-care, and then they can exchange those tokens for a pack of cigarettes or gum or things like that. And that's very effective, working in those ways. But again, this isn't, typically within the kind of things that I do. And so if I had someone that had like an addiction, like a chemical addiction or something, I'd send them to an addiction counselor. And if there's emotional, psychological, relational trauma, then I would say, okay, I'll deal with that part. You deal with the more behavioral part over there. And that's just the way that I work, and it seems to work. So, any questions about any of that? No? So behaviorism can be viewed as a reaction, perhaps, to psychoanalysis, or, again, if you wanted to turn psychology into an empirical science, like this is how you would try to do it. You would, kind of attend to behavior. You wouldn't be concerned about, motives and intentions and things like that. So it's an attempt to create a purely empirical psychology. It was thought that science needed to be empirical. Subjective thoughts, intentions, and feelings could not be empirically studied. Unfortunately, this would mean neglecting important aspects of human subjectivity and treating the rest of human psychology as a black box. So strict behaviorism can be conceived as a kind of environmental determinism, where the person is considered relatively passive, responding reflexively to genetically pre-specified conditions for reinforcement, interacting with environmental pairings to create novel and complex behavior through higher order conditioning. So again, there's nothing, from a behaviorist point of view, there's nothing ontologically unique that really separates us from other animals. And there's not a subjective, self-aware agent kind of throwing themselves into future possibilities and able to ascertain those various possibilities as they line up with their purposes. Like, that just doesn't seem to make sense. Or the behavior, to whatever extent that's possible, they're just not interested at all. Now, again, we can kind of poke at some of this, as I think we've been doing. We can ask, is there a meaningful distinction between a reinforcer and an incentive? And I think that there is. Kind of get at this in the next one. Yeah, we can talk about the difference between a material efficient cause and a motive framed as an intention, right? Now, motive, what motivates a person? This is what we're talking about. So in therapy, arguably, like, the most important thing, the first order of business, is asking the client, what are your goals? What are you trying to do? What can I help you with? What are we working to do here? Right? It's the compass, in a way. It gives you like a sense of where you're trying to go. It's not for you to say what the client needs to do, or the patient needs to do. You have no right to do that. This person has to define for themselves. Like, so it could be, well, I don't want to feel this way, or it could be, I don't want these relationships to fail in the way that they have. I want to be more assertive. I want to do this. I want to do that. Whatever. So it's important to get clear on that. But in addition to a goal, so the person defines a goal, you have to see if they're sufficiently motivated toward, addressing that goal. We can think about motivation in a couple different ways. One way is, I guess, in the way that maybe a behaviorist might, or someone. We can think of motivation in terms of, the things in your environment that impinge upon you that make life uncomfortable, let's say, right? So let's say a person comes into therapy and you say, why are you here? Well, I'm here because, they're in their early 20s, right? I'm here because my parents, want me to be here. Okay? So you're here because your parents want you to be here. Why do your parents think that you need to be here? Well, they're just, I guess, they don't like the fact that, I'm not working right now and I'm just playing video games all day. I like to get high too, and I guess I don't really socialize very much, and yeah, they got a problem with this, I guess. So is it a problem for you? I don't know. They think it is, right? Well, why are you here, though? They think that it is, so why are you here? Well, if I'm not here, they're going to kick me out, right? Oh, so you don't want to get kicked out of your house. Is that it? Is that the problem? You just don't want to get kicked out of your house? Yeah, I guess I don't want to get kicked out of my house, so I'm here. Now, this is a person who is arguably extremely passive, and they're relying on, I guess, the world to poke and prod them and push them along in a way that will get them to do things, right? But that's very different from a kind of motivation that emerges from the first person subject, right? So when you say like, well, look, is this a problem for you, do you think, that you're getting high every single day and you're playing video games and you don't really go outside or socialize with people? Is this an issue for you? Well, I'm not sure. Well, who would know, you know? I can't know that for you. I mean, I can say as a psychologist, like, well, in general, in theory, like, you know, people who kind of live this kind of existence, like, it doesn't turn out very well for them. I mean, I could say that, but, you know, that's more of a conceptual kind of theoretical way of looking at it. But in what way is it a problem for you? I mean, and they might say, like, well, yeah, I agree with all that. It's not good, right? Yeah, it's not good. But what you're saying, though, is that it's not good for one to engage in this sort of behavior, right? That's what you're saying. And you're looking at yourself as if from the outside in some theoretical way. But this is a problem for you. Do you have a feeling about this? Like if you look forward, you know, 2-3 years down the road and you're exactly as you are right now, how does that sit with you? Do you have a feeling about that? Is that a distressing thought in any way? If it's not, maybe it's not a problem, right? Maybe it's just a problem in theory, you know? What do you imagine? Like what would be a good life? What would be a life worth living, do you think? What would that look like, you know? And they might say, well, I don't know, maybe to be in a relationship, you know? Maybe it'd be to be independent or something like that. Okay, well, you fast forward, you know, 3 years or 6 months, whatever, you imagine that being a possibility, that you're in a relationship with someone, it's a decent relationship, you know, it feels fulfilling. You're independent, you're on your own, you got your own apartment, whatever. How does that thought, you know, if you imagine that, can you imagine that? You know, some people can't imagine that, but if, you know, can you imagine that? What does that feel like? How does that sit with you? Is there a visceral reaction as you know, as you imagine that? Now, to people that don't have that visceral reaction, it's very difficult. There's no, you know, there has to be some energy there, like there has to be some distressing possibility, I guess, or something that needs to get resolved in some way. You know, I'm not sure if you can imagine this, but, you know, contrast to maybe the behaviorist, like therapy is not a place where you go to get, you know, positively reinforced in the sense that, like, you feel really good every session, right? Anyone who's been in therapy, like, I think you know that, you know, sometimes it can be really uncomfortable. You know, first appointment can be very uncomfortable. Well, why is that? Well, because you're not there to talk about the weather. You're not there to talk about, you know, superficial things. You're there to talk about what's not working for you, in what way you're suffering, in what way you're struggling, in what way life is not what you want it to be. And you better have some feeling about that, right? I'm guessing it's probably some uncomfortable feeling. So to come into an appointment is to explore that, right? And naturally people, you know, they have some anxiety about that. So there's something threatening about engaging with myself in that way and allowing you, this person I've never met before, into my life in that way to help me make sense of it, to help me understand it, you know? So, but in order to, you know, kind of endure that discomfort that is a part of good therapy, you have to make sure that that person is sufficiently motivated, you know? Like, is this important enough for you that you're willing to endure the discomfort that we might run into as we're trying to settle this issue? Now, just as a little kind of secret or insight or something like that, clinicians who first start out, and this certainly happened to me, you see what this person is struggling with or that there's a difficulty or whatever, and you're trying to help them resolve it. And what ends up happening is that if you don't notice the importance of the goal and the motivation arising within the individual, what happens is that you end up taking that sort of task on. And you end up you're working really hard, and like you're walking out of the sessions and sweat's pouring out of your every pore, and you're trying as hard as you can to give this person whatever bit of advice or guidance or, you know, kind of strategies or whatever. But you're doing all the work. You're taking on the responsibility for, you know, what's going to happen here. And you can run into problems and therapy stalls out. So you really do have to ensure that that's clarified at the outset, that there's an internal, I guess, motivating force. Does that make sense? Yeah? And we're going to have to wrap up here in a sec, but I guess, can you see perhaps like the limitations maybe with the behaviorist approach as it applies to our understanding of the full person? Like, are we on the right track with that? You see that there's some potential issues there? If not, like if you want to really kind of push back and give you're welcome to do that in class time, but I would really invite you to do that on the online discussion boards. And you can do that anonymously, right? No one has to know who you are. And I think you can set up a thread on your own. It should be set up to do that. So, okay, we'll wrap up there for today. Office hours after class, people are welcome to drop by and chat.